If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the business of lifelong learning, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
And I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 156 of the Leading Learning Podcast. Today we're going to answer questions about learning business strategy that came out of a recent session we did with the Wisconsin Society of Association Executives. Before we get to those questions, though, we have a message from our sponsor for the fourth quarter of 2018.
Our sponsor this quarter is Review My LMS, a collaboration between our company, Tagoras, and 100 Reviews. As the name suggests, Review My LMS is a site where users can share and access reviews of learning management systems, and the focus is specifically on systems that are a good fit for learning businesses, meaning organizations that market and sell lifelong learning. Contribute a review and you get access to all existing and future reviews, and there are already 130 on the site. And if you don't have a review to contribute, there's also a subscription option. For details, check out reviewmylms.com.
Definitely do check out Review My LMS. It is set up so that you can access some of the reviews initially without even having to sign up, so that will give you a good feel for what to expect. For now, though, let's get back to the focus of today's episode. What we plan to cover came out of a recent webinar that we collaborated on with the Wisconsin Society of Association Executives, or WSAE. Jeff, you were the one who worked with WSAE on this, and my understanding was that it was billed as an online mentoring session focused on strategy and business models for association online education programs.
That's right. WSAE had been hearing from its members that they were looking for help with online education, so they contacted us about serving as a resource and then reached out to their members to determine what questions it would be helpful to address during the webinar. So what we're going to do here is kind of a replay, but a little bit of a revamp of that session in which we'll pose and answer the questions that were the focus of the webinar. And I'll highlight a few things before we dive into this. First of all, even though this was an association and an organization that has associations as members that we were speaking to, the points that we cover here do not apply only to associations. They apply to really anybody who's in the learning business. So that's one thing to highlight. Another is that they were interested specifically in online education. We think holistically about the learning portfolio, so really everything we'll say here applies to pretty much any learning business, regardless of the formats that you're focused on. And then the last thing that I do want to note is that this is another example of us trying to practice what we preach and leveraging some content that we already have. We already did this as a webinar session. We're now going back to revisit this and revamp it as a podcast episode.
So now let's jump into that first question, which is about the typical trajectory of education programs. What is that trajectory like from planning all the way up to maturity? And of course, handily, our learning business maturity model offers a way to think about that trajectory.
And we are getting a lot more questions, inquiries about the model, so it's nice to be able to raise it here. Now, of course, we're talking specifically about learning businesses with the maturity model. So again, these are organizations that market and sell lifelong learning, and at least that's how we think about it. And we've defined that much more extensively in other places, but that'll do for purposes of this episode. And the aim with the maturity model was to provide a framework to help surface and assess the potential problem areas for learning businesses, but then to provide a clear way to move from problem to opportunity, and then we hope to innovation. And it's also our intention that the model that we've developed is not just descriptive, so we're not just describing what a learning business is, but also prescriptive and motivational and prompting action and giving that action some direction and focus. So that's kind of what we set out to do with the maturity model.
Now, we have, of course, referenced the learning business maturity model a number of times on the podcast, and we even dedicated an entire episode to it. So we'll be sure to link to those past episodes as a reference. But for the convenience of you listening now, we'll also give a brief overview here. So we gauge maturity in this model according to characteristics and performance in 5 domains. And these are 5 domains that we found to be critical to the success of the learning and education businesses that we've been involved with over our years of experience. And those domains are leadership, strategy, capacity, portfolio, and marketing. In cases in which the learning business is part of a larger organization, and that's true with most trade associations and professional societies, in those cases, then the model deals with those domains in the context of the learning and education line of business, not the entire organization. So when we say strategy, we're talking about strategy for that learning business, not necessarily strategy for the entire organization. With the first domain, leadership, for example, we're talking about leadership of that learning business. And I'm not going to go into the details about each domain, but we'll include a link to the show notes where you can find out more about the domains and access questions about each of those domains. And those questions are actually going to help you home in on where your organization is, how it's doing in each of those domains. And then the other aspect of the maturity model is the stages. And we see maturity progressing through 4 stages. So stage 1, we characterize as static. Stage 2 is reactive. Stage 3 is proactive. And then stage 4 is innovative. In each stage, we gauge maturity according to the characteristics and performance in those 5 domains of leadership, strategy, capacity, portfolio, and marketing. And we've put together some profiles that are basically snapshots of learning businesses at each stage of maturity. Now, these profiles that we put together assume similar performance across all 5 domains. However, we know in reality, most businesses will actually perform better in some of the domains and worse in others. So you might be proactive in terms of your portfolio, but you might be more reactive in terms of marketing or vice versa.
So that's a good snapshot there of the maturity model. And again, we'll link to other episodes. We'll link to the visuals and the materials that go with the maturity model. So if you're not already familiar with those, you'll be able to get them through the show notes to this episode. And the next question that came up was basically a follow-on that I thought was really interesting and certainly an important question to ask. And that's, considering the model, are many associations thinking too small? And again, this applies to any learning business, not just an association. Why should a learning business aspire to maturity? What are the benefits? This really is a fundamental question, I guess, for any organization that's going to consider using the maturity model to be asking.
Definitely. And, we see at least 2 key reasons why learning businesses, at least most of them, probably need to be thinking bigger and striving toward maturity. The first is that being mature is really about effective delivery of value. So education and learning are usually a central part of the value proposition for an association, or if they aren't part of that, if they aren't central to the value proposition now, there's a good chance they need to be for the organization to remain and sustain relevance in the future. And pursuing maturity means pursuing higher value for members and customers. So that's reason 1, just that being more mature in your learning business means you're delivering more value. The second reason is that we are in an increasingly competitive market for adult learning. It's really a booming business these days. We're seeing big commercial players get into the space. We're seeing new startups. We're seeing infusions of venture capital. And so if you as an organization are not striving to continually improve and mature, there's a really good chance that some or even all of your education market share is going to erode.
And it's funny, we just sent a birthday card to a friend, and the message in that birthday card, I won't describe the picture that was on the cover of it, but the message inside was that maturity is overrated. And maybe in the case of birthdays it is, but I think in the case of learning businesses, maturity is definitely not overrated. Being able to reach the levels that we describe in the model is really going to give you a competitive edge. And as you were saying, Celisa, is going to make sure that you actually are delivering the value that you need to be delivering as a learning business.
So for next topic, let's talk about business models. So most organizations are working to provide a fairly narrow range of online education offerings to members to customers. And that, of course, begs the question, are there other business models to be thinking about, targeting a broader market, looking at wholesale, serving other organizations, working with universities, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, and this is, a very fertile area. There are so many opportunities now. I talk about a number of them in one of the chapters of my book, the Leading the Learning Revolution. It was really just focused specifically on business models. And I'll touch on just three of those right now. The first is, even if you are an individual member organization, like, a lot of the listeners were in this case, selling to institutional buyers can be a big opportunity. And this goes even for, solo edupreneurs. Those institutional buyers, it might be a corporation, might be government agencies, might be health systems, you name it. But the main point here is it's selling many seats at one time and possibly bundles and subscriptions really beats the heck out of trying to sell courses one by one, which can feel like a real slog, particularly when you're just starting out. So, thinking about what are the models for you to sell in bulk, basically to bigger buyers. Now, another opportunity is enhancing and extending whatever your existing offers are. So, even something as simple as a webinar can be turned into a much richer, higher value, and higher priced offering if you're able to blend it with valuable supporting materials or a focused and facilitated community element or possibly even face-to-face sessions that go along with it. So, think about the different ways you can leverage a single piece of source content, a single educational experience. You might be able to pare it down to reduce the value and the price and kind of reach a different segment of your audience, or you might be able to add value to it and increase the price. So really looking at your portfolio in that way, no matter what you're offering right now. And then the third one I'll mention, something we've been really bullish on and have done episodes on is virtual events. So taking that traditional conference type model and running a similar event, but offered virtually. This is something we've done. We do actually offer a virtual conference annually. And we've done episodes on that as well. But we think there is still a great deal to be done with virtual events. Certainly that applies to associations where events are a big thing, but it also applies really to any educational producer to bring people together in an online event, often a very economical way to reach a much, much bigger audience with your content and your expertise.
Now, when I brought up business models, one of the ideas that I threw out, one of the possibilities was, serving other markets. And I should say, though, that you didn't choose to elaborate on that.
I did not, no.
And that's because we're not really very bullish on going into new markets, at least not until you've really capitalized on lower hanging fruit. And then if and when you do pursue other markets, you really need to find ones that truly share similar characteristics and needs so that you can take your existing products into that market. And, because you really want to avoid, if at all possible, taking new products into new markets, because that's really high risk and very often can actually take you off mission, kind of move you away from what got you started in the first place. Now, collaboration with academia, on the other hand, particularly as a channel for content or a channel for credentials, that can be really powerful. That said, do keep in mind that it would require resources and a certain level of business development capability that a lot of organizations simply don't have. So you just have to be aware of what's going to be required, the skills and the time that go into that. I'll note that we did an episode a while back with Bill Clements of Norwich University, and that was specifically about collaboration with academia. So we'll be sure to include a link to that episode in the show notes.
I definitely do recommend checking out that interview with Bill Clements. He has some great things to say about how you can work with academia. But right now, let's shift gears just a little bit and turn to the topic of measuring impact. And, a question that comes up here is, beyond tracking enrollment and completion numbers and test scores, how do we recommend measuring the impact of education efforts? Because oftentimes the work we do, it feels like it's long-term, it's indirect, it's intangible. We're just not really sure how to really think about how is it that we're moving the dial with the students that we're serving. And this is a really important question in today's education market. So, first we'd say that definitely work on improving the type of numbers that are mentioned here. Enrollment numbers, completion numbers, test scores. For a lot of organizations, that's really where the initial focus should be, because they may not be really measuring those in a consistent and methodical way. So, putting the time and effort into doing that going forward, sharing that, having conversation around that as a team, or if you're on your own, just making sure you're analyzing that and making sure that you're getting the kind of movement that you want. So
having some targets so that whether you're achieving.
Yeah, definitely. You want to make sure that you have an idea of what you're trying to do, and then know whether you're progressing towards that or not. And then beyond that, getting better at evaluation. So collecting feedback from learners that is truly meaningful, which often doesn't happen, whether it's online or in conference sessions, seminars. A lot of times
it's pretty cold in here right now.
Yeah. You get that kind of feedback. The food's bad, that kind of thing, which doesn't tell you anything about whether learning is happening or not. So, a resource we recommend there is Will Thalheimer, his book, Performance Focused Smile Sheets. And in fact, anything Will writes, basically. But he really gets at how to ask questions that get much closer to really measuring learning. And that's the type of thing you want to be doing with your learning experiences. So it becomes more tangible, it becomes more direct. You can tell whether you're actually having an impact or not. And then the third thing that we'll mention here is making the effort to follow up with at least some portion of learners over the longer term to determine if the education they've received from you has actually positively impacted job performance or whatever the aim was. Often it is job performance. And this, of course, means doing some work up front to assess where learners are before and immediately after any learning experience with you, and then having a formal approach, and that's most often going to be a survey, to follow up at periodic points later. So for example, 3 months or a year later, to assess the outcomes, and potentially even providing them with some boosting along the way, some questions that you might put out there periodically to help draw their attention back to the learning experience that they had with you, and help them to re-engage and make sure that they're taking what they learned and implementing it, practicing it, making it part of their life on an ongoing basis. Now, for anybody who wants to go deeper on any of this, because we're just barely scraping the surface here with these comments, we do have an episode with Will Thalheimer, who I just mentioned, around the smile sheets and improving your evaluation. We'll link to that. We have an entire episode dedicated to the topic of impact. So if you share our passion for that, we'll also be linking to that episode, and that'll give you some more insights and tips around impact. And then finally, we want to point out that we have a session from Mark Nillis of Humentum, which was called Inside NGO at the time that he did this. But this was a presentation at one of our leading learning symposium events on the Brinkerhoff success case method. And this is a way of taking kind of qualitative approaches to whether a learning experience has been successful or not, and making those qualitative approaches a bit more rigorous, so you really can tell what people are getting out of them. So those are just a few resources that we would recommend to you to help you go deeper on this whole topic of impact, because it can be measured, it should be measured. It's much more important in today's learning landscape that learning businesses do measure it and demonstrate that they are, in fact, having an impact.
So let's shift the topic to developing products. And I suspect many learning businesses start with a basket of existing products or some ideas, and then they work to make those products or ideas available. And that's kind of the build it and they will come approach. But I also think that many learning businesses know that that can be a dangerous approach, and that a more strategic approach to developing products or refining educational offerings over time, that a more strategic approach really is needed, is warranted. So the questions here are, is there a framework for a product development process to follow? How do we figure out what educational offerings various market segments want? And how do we figure out what's most valuable to the market and those market segments?
And we won't go real deeply into the answers to those questions here, because we do have a lot of other resources around this, and we'll link to those in the show notes. But I'll start with the second area first. Understanding your market. You do need a solid approach to understanding your market and determining what products make sense. And there are really kind of two key parts to that. One is consistently monitoring the market so that you have a clear understanding of what audience needs are. In some cases, this is because they're explicitly saying they need something, but in other cases, it's because you're analyzing the signals, basically. And so we have a tool called the Market Insight Matrix. It basically just outlines an approach for doing this. So what are some of those ways that you can kind of listen into the market using things like social media, using tools like the analytics that come with any website these days? What are some ways that you can more explicitly ask the market, whether that's focus groups or surveys? And the main point of the matrix is that you need to have a blend, a diverse set of tools that you're using to analyze your market. It can't just be let's send out a survey every 3 or 4 years and hope that that's going to give us the information that we need. It's not. That's not going to be reliable. So in the matrix, we detailed a range of different tools that you can choose from, and you don't need to use every tool that's there, but just to make sure that you're using at least a few different tools to really listen into and monitor your market. So that's one part of it. And then the other part is that you need to understand your own portfolio and where the gaps might be in that portfolio. So, whether you are an association, a training firm, a solo entrepreneur, you've probably already got at least some products that you're putting out there, and you want to look at those kind of across what we call a value ramp. So some of those are likely very low cost or free. They're going to pull people in. Some of them are higher priced, and you're providing higher value. And when you lay those out across the value ramp, you're going to be able to see, are you telling a story that's kind of accelerating people, pulling them up the ramp of value that you're offering them, or are there big gaps there? Are they potentially getting some free content from you initially, and then there's nothing after that, or you're expecting them to buy a big ticket item right out of the gate when you haven't really provided them any value before that. So we discussed the value ramp in detail in other episodes and in a variety of other places. So we will link to all of those. And then, as far as taking all of that into a development process, you want to keep the same mindset you have when analyzing your market and realize that, developing a learning product is actually a learning process itself. So you have to be iterative. When you're out there listening to your market and trying to figure things out, you're not going to get the answer right away. You have to try things out. When you're trying to structure your portfolio, you're having to try things out. You have to do the same thing as you actually develop a product. And most instructional designers are going to be familiar with ADDIE, ADDIE, which is the analysis, design, development, implementation, evaluation. There's a lot to recommend that, but you have to allow for more flexibility when you're actually developing products. So, using a rapid prototyping approach, using piloting to test things out. And I actually discuss this in quite a bit of detail in a post that I wrote on it that we'll link to in the show notes for this episode as well, about how to create an online course. This takes you through sort of a modified ADDIE process, and between what you can do with the market matrix to assess your market, the value ramp to assess your portfolio, and then an iterative product development process, you're going to be in a much better place to figure out your educational offerings, put things out there that are actually valuable and that you're actually going to be able to get customers for in the end.
Well, and you brought up Addie there, which of course then brings up instructional design. And I know that often, especially in early stages, that a lot of organizations don't necessarily have the budget for professional instructional design. So then questions come up around what resources are out there to help your organization educate itself about instructional design while you work to build a budget for instructional design. And we have a number of our favorite resources that we'll enumerate here, and we'll make sure that in the show notes, if you want to go there, that we have links to more information about these. But we'll highlight a few. So Articulate has a great blog. It's the Rapid e-learning blog. This is you were just talking about the value ramp, Jeff. This is a great example of that kind of early free content that really pulls people in. Articulate does have a software products that it offers for e-learning, but the blog itself, just in general, is often a really good source for just thinking about some of what you were talking about with that the rapid prototyping and doing things like that. So that's a good source. Julie Dirksen has a book called Design for How People Learn, and we have a podcast interview with Julie, so we'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. Howard Stolovich and his book, Telling Ain't Training. We also have a podcast interview with him we'll link to. And then another book, E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. And this is by Ruth Clark and Richard Mayer. And this is kind of one of those books that we always refer back to. They have some really great research that they're pulling in, but then with always this idea to how to practically implement that research. So what does that research actually tell you about how you design learning? Michael Allen's Guide to E-Learning is another great resource. We have an interview with him, so we'll link to that. And also, Kathy Moore is a great resource, and we have an interview with her, and so we'll link to that. There are a ton of great resources out there. These, though, are some of our top picks. And so this, if you go to any of these folks, we'll think that you'll learn some good things, and, go to more than one of them and you'll learn some more good things.
And I think if listeners haven't already gotten this idea, this whole episode is sort of a poster episode for resources, I think, because we have a lot that we link to from this. It's a nice thing about doing a Q&A type session is it often brings up all of these things that are out there, and this gives us an opportunity to talk about them and also to bring them together in one place. And we'll make our usual pitch at the end to make sure you visit the show notes. This is definitely an episode in which you are going to want to visit the show notes. A lot of good links there. And as we're coming down the home stretch, one last area we want to look at. There was a question area. Was around, revenue and pricing. And of course, we are talking about learning business here. Most of the people who listen to us do have to actually generate revenue from the educational products that they offer. And so a question here was, if not required for continuing education credits or certification, online education in particular is often free. And we certainly see a lot of this in the association marketplace, but we see it also much more broadly. So there's always that worry, are we leaving money on the table? How do we determine the value of our education offerings and set prices? What are some steps we can take to move our online education programs from cost centers to revenue centers? Because that typically is the goal, again, for our listeners who are creating any type of education, online education included. And, I've written and spoken about this extensively, and we'll provide some links to some of the articles where this has been addressed and other resources. But really, when it comes to setting price, and price really is your kind of signal for value out in the marketplace, there are really just three components that are essential. The first is, what are your customers' points of reference for the offering? What is the main point of reference that they have for whatever you're offering? And you have to understand that when they're coming to you, discovering what you have, and potentially making a decision about what to whether to participate or not. they've got something in their head that they're referencing. And this goes back to listening to your market, understanding, what's going on in your market. You need to understand what that point of reference is. The second is, how does the offering fit into your overall product portfolio? And again, we were talking about this a little bit earlier with the value ramp. You usually, have offerings that span a range of value, and the pricing should reflect where it fits. Any given product fits within that range of value. So the product that you're trying to make a pricing decision about, where does it fit within your overall portfolio? Because you want to give it a pricing level that's rational there. Or potentially you need to look across your whole portfolio and make sure that everything is rationally priced. But you want the story that you tell about value across your portfolio and the prices that are associated with your different offerings to make sense to the people that you're selling to. And then finally, how do you add or remove value to impact the previous 2 points? So, your customers are coming to you with a particular point of reference. They've got other options in mind that they could potentially be buying from your competitors, whether they're direct or indirect. They've got a vision, whether it's correct or not, of where your offering fits, the particular offering fits within your overall portfolio. And so you have to look at whatever it is that you're trying to put a price on and say, okay, how do I add or subtract value here so it makes sense relative to the market and relative to the portfolio. And if you're looking at something like, online education and competing with free, for example, and if your customers have a lot of good free reference points, then you need to be thinking about, okay, what value am I adding to whatever I offer, and how do I situate that in my overall portfolio in a way that it makes it compelling for my prospective customers to pay for that offering. Now, this is all simple and straightforward. It's not necessarily easy to do. But I will make a couple of related suggestions to really generating more revenue from your educational products. And the first of those is, the number one thing that most learning businesses can do to become, more of a revenue center, to increase their revenue, to bring more money in for their educational offerings, is simply to start charging if you're not already. In a lot of cases, particularly online education, gets offered as kind of a loss leader. Stop doing that. Start charging. Or if you are charging, consider charging more, because usually you can raise your prices from anywhere to 10 to 25% with nobody batting an eyelash. And you'll automatically increase your net revenues by doing that. So consider charging and or charging more as a first move. And then second, and over the longer term, you have to do the kinds of things we've already been talking about. Put the effort into really understanding your market, put the effort into rationalizing your portfolio and how the different parts of it relate in terms of value to each other, and really focus in on articulating and delivering value. And again, all of this is simple, straightforward, not necessarily easy to do. But once you really start focusing in on it and using some of the tools and resources we've talked about here, you'll have the opportunity to really determine how to get the most out of your educational offerings.
So this has been a look at some real-world questions about learning business strategy, about business models, about many things. And what we've been talking about all along are resources that can help you on that trajectory as you're looking to become a more mature learning business. So we really encourage you to check out the show notes for this episode. And to do that, go to leadinglearning.com/episode 156.
And when you check out the show notes, you'll see various options for subscribing to the podcast. And if you're getting value out of what you hear, we'd be truly grateful if you would subscribe. It helps us get some data on the impact of what we're doing. And of course, impact was one of those topics that we covered during the episode.
We'd also be grateful if you would take a minute to give us a rating on iTunes. You can go to leadinglearning.com/iTunes, and that will put you in the right place. Jeff and I personally appreciate your rating and review. But more importantly, reviews and ratings help the podcast crop up in the search results when people look for topics that we cover. So please do us and your learning business peers a favor and go leave a rating and a review for the Leading Learning podcast.
And we'd be grateful if you'd take a minute to visit reviewmylms.com. Celisa and I put a lot of effort into the Leading Learning podcast, and one of the main reasons we're able to do that is because we generate revenue through other sources like Review My LMS. So please take a minute to go and leave a review if you can, or subscribe if you're not in a position to leave a review, and you'll know that you're helping to support the Leading Learning podcast.
Finally, consider telling others about the podcast. You can send out a pre-populated tweet by going to leadinglearning.com/share. Or if tweeting isn't your thing, pick the social network or other medium of your choice and spread the good word.
Thanks again, and we'll see you next time on the Leading Learning Podcast.